Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The 4 Pillars of Certificate Automation. I'm Kristen Santos, Marketing Specialist at Sectigo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Presenting with us today, we have Sectigo's CTO of PKI, Jason Soroko. Hi, Jason. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
And joining Jason will be Chief Compliance Officer at Sectigo, Tim Callan. Hey, Tim. How's it going?
Hi, Kristen.
Right, so before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, and we're expecting that to be around 45 minutes and allow for 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You'll be able to submit any questions you might have using the chat throughout the webinar. But that's it from me. Without further ado, Tim, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Kristen. So what we want to talk about today is the 4 pillars of certificate automation, and we'll go into the detail of this, but this is a model that we've evolved over time that I think helps explain how to compartmentalize and think about certificate automation. And we do have these 4 basic components of it that you see here: deploy, discover, revoke and replace, and renew. And we'll go into each of these. And then there's kind of a capstone, a penumbra that applies to and affects and ultimately enables all 4 of these pillars, which is visibility. And so visibility is very important as well. So at the end, after we've gone deep on the 4 pillars and explain what they are and why they matter, then we'll come back and we'll talk about how visibility interacts with all of this. So sounds good, Jason?
Sounds great, Tim, thanks.
All right. So first, before we get into this, there are some general things to think about. So, we're going to talk about certificate automation, and certificate automation obviously is automating the various processes that you would do within your digital certificates. And before we get into these 4 pillars, there are general considerations for any automation platform or solution, or any certificate automation platform or solution, that I think are very important. And I think you want to think about these as you're working on how do I apply my my automation solution successfully. So for instance, certificate types, right? You want to make sure that you're thinking about the full set of kinds of certificates that are working toward your automation, right? So it's not just one thing like SSL. It's great if you can do SSL, but you probably have SMIME certs too. So can I also automate my SMIME certs, right? Public versus private trust, and then the authentication levels. Like, so for instance, if I have an SSL solution, but it only works for DV, that's fine if you only use DV. But if you're using AV and OV as well, then it would be better if you had an automation solution that worked for everything. And so, those are a full set of considerations we need to have. The next is, though, that it can be more than just certificates, right? So for instance, if you're running your own private CA, you should think about automation that's around your private CA. Or if you're using, let's say, SSH keys, which are not certs, but they're still PKI, you should be thinking about automation around your SSH. So, you can think broader than just those, simple, well-defined forms of public certificates. And then lastly, it's a platform. And there's all kinds of things that we always worry about with our platforms. We want them to have high uptime. We want them to have high availability and be robust and not buggy and secure and comply with our requirements, and et cetera, et cetera. I could probably increase this list, but this is a platform. It's a critical platform. It's a platform you're relying on. So as you're thinking about how am I going to use my automation solution, you also want to, of course, be making sure that you consider all these things just as you would for any IT service. So Jason, before we get into the specifics, do you want to add anything to that?
Tim, just to highlight what you've talked about here, which is the fact that digital identities, as we had said even years ago, we knew that they were going to proliferate. But I think the proliferation, not even just of the numbers of certificates, but of the types, which is what you're talking about here. And yeah. I think in each of these areas, we could probably have a webinar, a plus worth of material on each of these areas.
And we may.
Yeah, there's a lot of richness here.
Yeah, but just starting with these basics, like, and these are just things to consider. And as we're going to go deep dive on all these different pillars and stuff, but don't forget that these ideas that we're talking about on this slide will apply to everything that we move in throughout the webinar. So with that, first let's talk about deployment. So what do we mean when we say deployment? We mean that you need to be able to start, ideally, it means you start from nothing. You start from the concept of, oh, I'm going to need a cert. And you end with a working cert on your server or wherever it belongs that is functioning correctly. And as close as you can get to that, that's really what we're looking for with deployment, what we mean when we say deployment.
Yeah, Tim, there's a word here that's often also used, which is provisioning.
Sure.
And this is why at the bottom you see these provisioning protocols, just such as Acme, SCEP, EST, and there's also others as well. And basically, it's one thing to be able to issue a certificate. PKI Technology has been able to do that for years. But one of the development areas that has been very important, even more recently, has been how do you effectively get the certificate from where it's being issued to where it needs to be. And that's especially true in things like DevOps, IoT, mobile devices, etc. There's a lot of technologies that need to be brought to bear when you talk about deployment as a whole.
Yeah, and so you know, as you kind of touched on, there are two main ways when you're actually trying to get the cert installed. There are two main ways that this can be automated, and one of them is what we call agent-based. So you take an agent, you install it, and it sits on your servers or somewhere in your environment, and it can actually take these certs and install them for you, and that agent operates. And the other way that you can do it is it's API based. So you use something like Acme, and this ties into, you know, a lot of different platforms. And so I can use Acme and it connects directly to my platforms, and it can do that there as well.
Some might argue that Acme, SCEP, and EST are actually types of agents.
Sure.
And API based would, you know, good old REST API languages being able to talk to an API to be able to provision a certificate or sometime a batch of certificates is also interesting.
Sure. That's a great one. That probably should have been on here. That's another example of how you might use your automation. So what are the benefits, right? Like why does this matter? I think the most important one is consistent, accurate installation. So your certs are installed, they're installed correctly, on time, where they're supposed to be, right cert is installed, and it's done the way that it's expected, right? Pure and simple. So you don't have installation errors, installation snafus, installation problems. You don't have, but it's not just like that it's bug free. It's also that it's things like it's compliant. It's the way I want. So I know it's the certs that I chose. I know they're the cert types that I want. I know that they're the term that I want, and all of that is done correctly.
You know, Tim, I would say that the only use case where manual provisioning was normal was in the legacy SSL use case, where you might have had just one or two web servers, you obtain an SSL certificate, and then you manually implement it into your web server. That was a practice for a long time, and it still is in some areas. However, when you consider newer enterprise use cases, especially things like IoT, DevOps, you know, enterprise-wide mobility, this is an area where this kind of automation technology is just vital now in the realm of PKI and certificates.
Yeah, and then so that's the biggest benefit, right? Because the biggest benefit is you don't want stuff to fall over, break, not work correctly. I think a second benefit that is still very real is improved efficiency. Like this stuff is laborious and difficult, even when you're talking about the things where it's possible, like, you know, TLS certificates that are going to sit there for a year. It's laborious and difficult, and it uses your highly trained SSL IT staff in a poor way, right? So the improved efficiency of automation is a very real benefit as well. And then of course, the great thing is if you deploy them in your certificate platform, now they're living in your certificate platform. So as we move on to the other automation activities, you've automatically included these certificates in that whole certificate life cycle.
Tim, if I were to add one bullet point, I would say security as a benefit. Uh, and every one of those deployment protocols that you had mentioned on the previous slide brings some level of security as a best practice to the way that the certificate is actually provisioned. Because older manual methods of doing things, there's problems with just leaving a certificate on a file system and not transporting it in an encrypted state. But those protocols, that's how they're designed. That's why they're designed the way they are. So I think that would be a fourth bullet point here with benefit of security.
Okay, added security. I love it. Very good, Jason. So those are the things that we get from automated deployment. The next pillar is discovery. So what do we mean when we say discovery? What we mean discovery is that every large organization that I've ever interacted with has had a syndrome that we call rogue certificates. And what happens is, for one reason or another, someone who ultimately isn't rolling up to the CIO or the CISO is out there obtaining certificates and using them on services that ultimately drive business goals. So this could be developers who are working and creating their own systems and getting their own certificates. It could be people who are doing development for various functions of the company. Maybe HR, puts together an employee-facing system, or maybe marketing puts together, some customer-facing system, or service does, and they use their own development resources, and those resources get certs, and then suddenly the new customer portal's running and it's hugely successful and everyone loves it and it's going great, and then a year from now, blammo, one day the portal doesn't work and nobody knows why, right? And it turns out it's because that development shop bought certificates, stuck it on there, and then they went off to do something else for some other client, and no one knew about those certs and renewed those certs. So what discovery does, the idea behind discovery is find these things, search your network or a domain space, find your active certs, bring them under management, and do it before you have a problem because you did not know that these certs existed.
Boy, could I tell you stories, Tim, over the years of customers who, and we're talking, I think, Tim, the only point I want to make here is this problem is not just for small resource constrained organizations. This is especially true for sometimes large distributed enterprises where security is an afterthought. The left hand, the right hand aren't always talking, and that's fine. These are busy organizations. But as you said, Tim, when certificates have been acquired or have been issued for various reasons that aren't tracked extremely well and have been automated, discovery is a really important capability that you need to have, especially sometimes to bootstrap an organization back into governance.
Yeah. And then the other part of discovery is not just getting all of these certificates, like knowing that they exist and when they're going to expire, but it's also knowing what they are, right? So are these certificates what we expect? Are they meeting our own needs that we've set down for what we want from a certificate? Again, this could be term or key length or supplier or public private or all kinds of other things. If you don't know what certs are out there, you also don't know what those certs are. And what if they're not what you want? What if they're not what you consider to be acceptable?
Tim's on other webcasts and podcasts, you and I have talked about deprecations. They seem like they don't happen often, but when they do, you sure want to have that discovery capability.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a big one. Discovery, and discovery is I think it's oftentimes the unthought about of these four pillars. Is that the right way to say that? The pillar that isn't really thought about so much, but it can make a big difference because, it's the difference between having things automated and under management and not. So discovery is very important and I think often neglected. So what do we get from discovery? Well, first and foremost, prevent unexpected outages. The number of headlines that still as late as 2020, I don't think there's been a major one in 2021 so far, not that I know of, but as late as 2020, major services going down because of unexpected certificate expirations. It's absolutely crazy. So the first thing you can do is prevent unexpected outages, pure and simple. Biggest benefit of this. Secondly, it helps you know your whole certificate world. You can start planning and managing your renewals, right? And part of that is you can optimize your spend. So if I've got some certs, if I've got a volume deal and I'm getting my certs at a bulk rate, and I've got yahoos in my organization out there buying their own certs off websites at the website rack rate, then I'm spending more money than I should be, right? And if we bring that together, you can optimize your spend. And then you already mentioned governance, right, Jay? I think this is a big one. It's just the ability to say, I know what's going on. I have visibility on all my certs. I understand what's happening, and I'm able to ensure that what we're doing as an organization is what I am expecting to do.
I think the outages and the governance are the real big ones on this chart, Tim. We've just seen it over and over again.
Yeah, the outages are just crazy. It's just crazy. All right, so certificate automation, pillar number 3, revoke and replace. So, certificates, obviously, they have a life cycle, right? I take a cert, I install it. It's going to last a certain amount of time. At the end of that, it's going to expire, and that's the last pillar, renew. But part of the reason we use certificates is because we have control over them during their life cycle. And that means that we can revoke a certificate if we don't want it to be active anymore, or we can replace a certificate if we still want to do that, but the old cert for some whatever reason is unusable and I need a new cert in its place. And so, revoking certificates, once you have your certificates in your management console, you can see them, you can know what they are, you can look at them, and the part of what that means is you can revoke any given certificate that you want to revoke. So, I've got a reason, I've got a problem, I need to go and blow up a cert and get rid of it. Or I need all certs of a certain type, or I need all certs that were deployed in this certain time frame to get revoked. All of these things become so much easier, so much more doable if you have kind of a robust, sensible automation solution that you're using when you manage your certificates.
Tim, when I think about this, this slide as it looks applies to this subject in general, but it especially applies to publicly trusted certificates. You and I talk quite a lot about the length of time before expiry, and I would say that expiry is one of those topics that we'll probably get into it in the next pillar. But to add to this, to keep in mind that in many use cases such as IoT or DevOps or many other types of authentication use cases for a PKI certificate, revocation is increasingly becoming unusual because of the fact that of the operational nature of what's going on within the enterprise. And so therefore we're starting to see shorter and shorter expiry times for certificates. And that's where your last two pillars kind of blend together.
Yeah.
And so therefore, hence the need for automation and management of these certificates.
Yeah, but even then, like depending on the nature of the cert, so certainly there are scenarios where revocation seems almost silly. And so, on our podcast, we talked to a DevOps professional at one point who said that, their certs, their TLS certs that they use in their DevOps environment live for, I think it was 2 hours, right? So if it's a 2-hour lifespan, you kind of think, am I really revoking a lot of certs? But there still are tried and true large volume certificate solutions out there, right? SMIME certs last for years, code signing certs last for years, TLS certs can last for a year, public TLS. And even if you're using an automated solution and you're cutting down the time, even then people are normally talking 90 days. So 90 days is plenty of time to do damage. So, revocation is, I think, going to be a very real thing for a long time, even considering the trend you're talking about, Jay. And being able to, again, know what they are, revoke them with one push of a button, and then see and know that they're revoked, right, are all really great things that you can get from your management platform. Then the second half of this, of course, is replacement. So oftentimes the certs are going away, but the services aren't, the servers aren't, the functionality isn't. And so I don't just have to revoke the certs, I have to replace the certs. So under those circumstances, it kind of goes back to pillar number one. Now we're getting a fresh cert. What you want to do is you want to automatically say, I want to revoke the cert, but I want to revoke it with replacement. And then your system automatically can and should go get a new cert that meets the qualities of the cert that's being gotten rid of and install that cert for you in the same location, with the same nature. And so that, that's what we mean by replacement. And I think that's a very important capability as well. So what are the benefits? So first of all, like we talked about, agile, accurate revocation of certificates. A real bad scenario is where there's a cert that needs to be revoked, but it doesn't get revoked, right? Gee, something happened. There was somebody trolling around my network, and I'm afraid that these private keys may have been stolen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the certs that have those private keys, and I'm going to replace them with new certs with new keys. Well, gee, you don't want to miss one of those, right? So agile, accurate revocation of certificates is really, really important. And it can help you defend against breach or defend against compliance failure. And then, of course, what we talked about before, prevent errors. You'd hate to not get the replacement certs installed correctly when you revoke the existing certs and then your systems go down, right? And this has happened too. And that would be really bad. That's a bad outcome. So accurate, compliant, predictable installation of replacement certs is very important. And then, of course, we do come back to the employee timing thing again, right? And we know that's not the main driver. We know that outages are the main driver, but you get a benefit that's very real, which is that your critical path, highly skilled employees are freed up to do other things with their valuable time.
Yeah, Tim, this is an incredibly important topic. I would say, just to add a little color, I want everybody to consider that this is one of the reasons why, if you're, a vendor of an IoT system, if you are an enterprise IT manager who has digital certificates that are under your purview, wherever you're putting your certificates, you not only want to be able to track them, you want to be able to, at a moment's notice, be able to hit that revoke button and be able to replace as quickly as possible, because you just never know what can happen.
Yeah. And one of the things about revocation is revocations don't tend to be planned, right? Revocations don't tend to be driven by the IT organization. They can be, but revocations very frequently are responsive. Something happened. There was a breach, there was a problem, and now we need to revoke all of these certificates, and we need to do them right now because every minute that they're out there, someone might be abusing them, right? That's real. Or my CA has informed me that this certificate needs to be revoked because the private key was found somewhere, and it's going to be dead in 24 hours, whether I like it or not. And these are real scenarios that really happen in the real world. And so that's where agility and responsiveness is so important, because this isn't something where you sit and you put it on the roadmap and you plan it and you say, okay, we're going to do it on Tuesday at 2:00. This is something where somebody's phone rings and they say, we have a crisis, we need to revoke this cert, we need to do it right now.
Tim, think about an ATM machine that's sitting in a remote location. Might be difficult to administrate. Certificate is compromised, it's revoked, that machine is dead. What do? Right? The ability to automate the renewal, the ability to replace, is incredibly important. And so think about where your certificates are going. Think about those emergency moments where a revocation is necessary, and then think about what kind of automated tool you need to be able to accomplish that replacement in a timely manner.
Yeah, exactly. So renewal. So certificates have a lifespan. Certificates end. They all end by design. This is on purpose. You and I did a whole podcast just on this topic, Jason, right? That all certificates must end. That's the point of a certificate. But certificates end does not necessarily mean that the thing they're doing ends. And that's where renewal comes in. So our certificates are going to expire. When they expire, we need to renew them. And this is a critical function for automation, perhaps the most critical of all four of these pillars. So an automated solution, your automation platform, needs to detect and track the certificates that are coming up on their expiration date. It needs to make you aware of what needs to be renewed and then automatically obtain and install certificates for the renewal prior to the expiration of the old certs. What were you going to say, Jason?
No, Tim, I just to repeat something I had said earlier, this is where it fits the best, is increasingly we're finding in private trust use cases the need for shorter and shorter lifespans of certificates, expiry dates that are quite short. And because of the fact that revocation really isn't a technical possibility. And so that really has driven the need for innovation within renewal in PKI, and the industry has stepped up to that. But as I think, as you said earlier, Tim, this really is probably one of the most important automation areas we have in PKI right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, just the last point to clarify is sometimes I don't want to renew certs, right? Sometimes I've sunsetted something and that cert sat for the rest of its, lifespan unused. And at the end of it, I need to be able to flag that and say this is a non-renewal cert and have that just go away and not, waste my resources or my money on that. So that's a functionality you don't want to ignore. It's in the minority, but when it comes up, it's important and it's something you need to be able to do. So now, what are the benefits? So this might be sounding familiar by now. First of all, most important, prevent outage or breach. Right? It's very, very, very. This is the scenario. This is where it comes up. Everything's running great. Everybody's happy, and then one day a certificate breaks or a certificate expires and everything breaks, or a certificate expires and some protective functionality breaks and people don't realize it, and that's how the bad guys get in, or how the bad guys do their damage. So preventing outage and breach is the biggest benefit by a long shot in this case. But of course, it's also more efficient. So you're absolutely saving employee time, and that's a good benefit. And it's a great way. It also helps with currency and compliance. So if I have updating standards or requirements in my own enterprise, if I'm updating my platform, from here on out, all certificates are going to use ECC instead of RSA, let's say. Or from here on out, let's use a realistic future example. In a couple years, from here on out, all certs are going to use post-quantum algorithms. Then what happens is you build that right into your automation platform, and your automation platform just cycles out those certs, and it's doing it for you, and you're confident that none of them is getting missed, and it's done every time.
Tim, I just want to add to the second point, the saving of employee time. Especially in publicly trusted certificates, SSL, I think it's been such a long tradition of manually renewing certificates, basically by a Linux administrator. If you were to add up the amount of time it takes to do the event, it's quite a lot of time.
Yeah.
That person could be doing something else. That's an important rare skill set.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
absolutely should be. It absolutely should be automated for all the reasons you've just said. But I will invite anybody to add up the costs, especially if you have to multiply it by the number of web servers that you have. It adds up to quite a lot of money. We've done our own thinking about that internally here, and at loaded labor rates, it's quite an expensive event. So don't underestimate bullet point number 2.
Absolutely. So then there's visibility. So visibility just kind of helps enable and benefits from all of these points of automation. And so what do you get with visibility? Well, part of it is, what do I have? I get to see how many certs do I have? What are they? How are they being used? What are the qualities of those certs, right? Do I have the right hashing algorithms? Do I have the right time expiration times? What CAs are issuing them? All of that gets built in where I can see it, right? And I can know what it is, and I can know that it matches again what I want it to be. And then along the same lines, you can know any certs that don't. So for instance, if I've got certs that have key links that are too small, I can have my automation platform say this is the minimum, and anything that's below that, I need to be informed. Right? And it'll, and it's real easy. It's ultra easy under those circumstances, especially if you've discovered your certs or you've deployed them directly inside of your platform and you're confident they're all there. It's very easy for you to have a high degree of confidence that you really have an understanding of what's there, and you have an understanding that everything is there is matching the standards you've set out for yourself.
Tim, I just bear with me for even just a moment here, where I'll give you my favorite visibility story of most recent times. For those of you who in enterprise IT organizations that have DevOps teams, the DevOps teams typically work with containerization technologies, Docker being a very popular one. As soon as you have more than 1 or 2 or 3 containers, you typically want to orchestrate those containers.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most popular orchestration engines being Kubernetes. Fun fact, Tim, as soon as you set up a Kubernetes cluster, you have set up a certificate authority.
Yep.
Because TLS certificates are used by containers to communicate to each other and to the cloud and to various other resources. So there's all kinds of certificates that are being generated within a containerization orchestration engine. Well, that certificate authority might not be part of the same kind of PKI governance system you have in your enterprise for human authentication or even for publicly trusted certificates. Therefore, same problem, Tim. Every single one of these bullet points you have on this slide are something you no longer have visibility to
Right.
an incredibly important certificate authority that's running probably a very important, critical web application that is being served through modern technologies. Unless you gain that visibility back to those newer forms of technology that are using certificates, you have the same problems that you think you might have solved in previous generations of PKI.
Right. Yep, exactly. And as we've talked about in the past, a lot of people aren't even aware that's going on. Right? So
I would say there's even risk officers who are very hip to this stuff who might not be aware of it.
yeah, for sure. Now, so what form does visibility take? So reporting is very important. This is kind of some of the scenarios we're talking about on the left. Show me how many we have. And that could be, just a big list, a list kind of report, but it also could be, pie charts and various other things that help you understand at a macro level what's happening. Dashboards are great. So you can go in and look at things in real time and drill down and move around. Alerting. really important, right? Hey, the following certificate's going to expire tomorrow. Nobody's done anything. Alerting is very, very important. And search, right? To be able to go in and say, I want to know about a specific thing and make a specific query. Maybe querying is a better word here. Make a specific query and find out the specific answers to the question you want to ask right now. So those are the main kind of basic forms of functionality that you want your visibility to take. Now, what are the benefits? Well, the biggest one, the first one in my mind, is that you can discover potential problems and act on them before they become real problems. So I see certs that are not secure or not compliant. I see certs that are coming up for expiration, and I do something about them before it's a problem, right? So I don't have an outage. I don't have a breach. I don't have a mandatory notification event. I don't have bad headlines because I get those things done before I ever get there. And then, of course, planning and optimizing, right? We've talked about that before. If I know what I have, I can understand how I'm using those things. I can do things like, standardize, consolidate vendors, things along those lines. Know when things are going to happen. See how that compares to vacation schedules. All that stuff can be done. Demonstrate that I'm secure and I'm compliant, right? Show my board of directors, show my auditors, show that big, incredibly important customer who's demanded that they want to know the following. So being able to demonstrate your compliance and your security and your governance is very important. And then lastly, peace of mind. We have a case study from one of our customers, a company called Medecision, and one of the things that they talk about is I can sleep at night because I know that nothing's breaking that I'm not aware of, right? And peace of mind is incredibly important, right? Not spending every second of every day wondering if that a certificate expiration just gave you an outage and your phone's about to start ringing. So all those things together wind up being very real benefits of visibility.
Yeah, Tim, the only thing I really have to add to that is there are other verticals where the list of benefits are so rich that you could probably have entire webinars on that alone. I'm thinking of one being something like manufacturing, where as devices are coming off of the plant floor and certificates are issued into them, the ability to track the genuineness of those devices is an enormous benefit, right? So there's all kinds of benefits that you could list per vertical. And I would say visibility being a capstone to all these 4 pillars that we've been talking about today is incredibly important.
So, sorry for the build there. So just as a reminder, deploy, discover, revoke and replace, and renew. Those are the 4 pillars. Visibility is the capstone that sits on the top of them. So with that, I think we're probably ready to get to the Q&A. I have mentioned a couple times, Jason's in my podcast. We do a podcast called Roost Causes. We've done more than 150 episodes. They're all available. You can find them at the Sectigo website, or you can find them on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, etc. Just search for Root Causes PKI will be the first thing that comes up. We go deep dive on all kinds of topics like this one and a lot of other things, really focused on the world of PKI, digital certificate, digital identity, and things along those lines. So please come check us out. We'd love to have you as an audience member. And with this, I think we're ready for questions. Christian, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Tim, we got a few questions.
Okay,
So,
cool.
with CRL processing being heavy workload for an IoT device, is an expiry very important part of PKI certificate process?
It is. In fact, what I'm seeing as a trend, especially in the consortia, Tim, you and I have talked to these people, and what we're finding is that because of the risk of breach, they are finding that as part of their best practices, lowering the expiry time, in other words, the length to live for a certificate within their environment is now getting quite short. I actually know of a consortia right now where the lifetime of a certificate for aviation is basically the length of a flight. They actually renew the certificate every time the airplane lands.
Right.
And in DevOps, Tim, you just mentioned, we're seeing best practices of 2 hours, and sometimes I've even seen less. So, CRLs are absolutely heavy-handed. OCSP has its own weight as well. And when you're dealing with either extremely low latency environments, or you're dealing with environments that aren't really even connected all the time, CRLs and OCSP responders for revocation are not a technical possibility. And so therefore, the way to get around that is to have pillar part of what was pillar number 3, which is automation technology around renewals. That's an important trend, especially in private trust. But we are seeing that the importance of that now, even in public trust. Tim, you know it very well because of the fact that we're now down to, 1 year and 90-day certificates within the publicly trusted realm.
Right, absolutely. So in the summer, the duration, the allowable duration of a TLS certificate went from 27 months down to 13 months. And that means that, everybody who's manually doing those certs is now doing them twice as often as they were before. And in the long run, it's easy to imagine that it doesn't stop there, that they get shorter, that maybe, in a year or two, maybe we're looking at 6 months, right? And so as we do that, that's just going to become more and more burden on that side of things also.
Great. And this actually kind of piggybacks off that question.
Okay.
So in automating the reissuing of certificate with a short expiry is back-end work, right? And that can be handled by the server, not the IoT device, right?
Yes, in fact, the IoT device is typically just the host of the certificate for the purposes of authentication, encryption, etc. The knowledge of when the renewal has to happen can be done in a centralized policy-driven location, which would be, as you say, server side. So yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, next up, how can I best deal with third-party affiliates who want copies of the certificates we issue for them? SSL Auto for LDAP authentication, for example.
How can I best deal with third-party affiliates who want copies of the certificates we issue for them? Jay, do you have a thought on that?
I would say the only time you want to copy a certificate in most cases is for escrow purposes. In other words, think about SMIME, for an example, SMIME where you're encrypting and signing emails. It's a very good practice right now for a modern PKI to hold a copy of an SMIME certificate in escrow, so that if the holder of the SMIME certificate loses their device or damages the device, or somehow that the provisioned SMIME certificate has been lost, you can then pull it out of a safe escrow. And also, the reason why you'd want to be able to pull it out of escrow is if you want to use that SMIME certificate in multiple locations, such as a laptop, a mobile device, perhaps a second laptop, etc. In terms of affiliates, though, which is the question, I would say I don't understand the use case. It could be just something I'm overlooking, but I would say typically an affiliate, a partner, or somebody you're working with that wants to do a form of authentication alongside of you, best practice would be to issue them their own certificates. Having copies of certificates in most cases is not a great idea.
Okay, on to the next one. What are the best tools for certificate rotation?
Depends on the use case. In DevOps, it can be as low as 2 hours. In publicly trusted certificates, 1 year, 90 days. So the span is typically between those two extremes at the moment. There are such thing as fire and forget certificates for things like smart meters that might have very long length certificate lifespans, but that's a very special use case.
Right.
I would say that there is no general rule of thumb in PKI in general. It really has to be thought out carefully for the use case that you're dealing with.
So in terms of the tools, so Jason, what tools would they want to use for certificate rotation then?
Well, what you'd absolutely want to have is an automation platform where you've done your discovery, you've done your you have your visibility in place, and then when those certificates are meant to be rotated, as the I think it was one of the first questions you asked, Christian, was basically how, in terms of how that's done. That's probably another one of the pillars that Tim talked about earlier, which is deployment. So in other words, you could actually notify an Acme agent to be able to then call a new certificate to be pulled. And so I think that's an interesting question that almost touches not only all four of the pillars, but also the capstone. So that what you're describing there is how automated PKI would work in general with all of these concepts in place.
All right.
All right, thank you. And if I run a private CA with my own certificates, do all of these pillars still apply to me?
100%. I would say that if you've started cleanly and you have visibility to everything, I think that discovery would
Right.
be the one that you
Yeah.
might not need as much. However, I think in most modern organizations, discovery is important because, as Tim said I think on his very first slide, the proliferation of certificates within an enterprise IT environment are so vast that I would doubt that you wouldn't need discovery at some point.
And by the way, who says that you even know of all the private CAs that are running, right? So the skunkworks scenario that I talked about before isn't necessarily just somebody's out there buying certificates on the open market. Somebody might be standing up a CA. And so discovery could make you ultimately learn that there's an entire CA you're not aware of. And that sounds crazy, but it has happened.
And it's going to happen more and more, Tim.
Yeah.
All right, lots of good questions coming in. So there was an interesting example of compromised cert on a remote machine. Could you provide a way to renew and deploy the cert in such a case?
Well, it depends on how the connectivity to the machine, right?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the ATM example maybe. The ATM example would be, a copy of the certificate was found in the wild, Tim, as an example. And we know that from that point, it was found on the dark web. And we know we need to revoke it. So what would happen is that ATM machine is, even if it's not connected, that at the very least, the PKI system could make a notification so that if it's an unconnected ATM machine, then at the very least you could send out the human being to go out and basically rotate that certificate, renew it, if it has to be done manually. That's an extreme case of a remote machine. It's also quite common for this to happen in other IoT use cases as well, where typically, at the absolute very least, if the IoT device happens to be sleeping for a certain portion of its life in order to save on battery power or whatever happens to be, when the device happens to check in, once a month or once every, however long it is, at least once it checked in, the system would be able to tell it, well, your certificate has been revoked. It's time to do the rotation, and therefore you might invoke the EST protocol to be able to then redeploy that certificate, which is pillar number one. So once again, this, I think what's interesting about all these questions is, Tim, regardless of the question, it touches either one or sometimes all of these pillars depending on what the revocation or the rotation, the renewal use case happens to be.
Right.
Perfect. And another question, where can I find example deployments of automation?
Tim, you want to take that one?
Where can I find example deployments of automation? I don't have a good example for that. We actually have, there is a trial version of our Sectigo certificate manager. So one thing you can do is you can go play with it yourself. You can get a 30-day trial. It doesn't cost you any money. And you can throw some certs in there and you can see what it does. So that certainly is an option. I'm not sure if that's exactly what the audience member is requesting, but that's one thing you could do.
Yeah, there are ways to stand up certificate authorities, even in the open source community. But the question is automated PKI. And
Right.
so an automated certificate authority, I think, Tim, you gave a perfect example of, we have the ability to stand up a private certificate authority very quickly, and then you can start to issue your own self-signed certificates from that walled garden of trust for test purposes, and watch what automation can do for you. What I'd even add to that, Tim, is we also have toolkits to even automate the creation of hybrid quantum resistant certificates. So
Mm-hmm.
therefore, depending on how future-proof you want your system to be, depending on how automated you want it to be, I definitely think that we offer those capabilities for anybody who wants to check it out for themselves.
Perfect. And just for the audience reference, I did drop into the chat a link to our Sectigo certificate manager trial if you wanted to check that out.
Thanks, Kristen.
Okay, and another question, how do these ideas work with non-SSL certificates like code signing?
So yeah, to some degree, I think they still do. Deploy is a little like, how do you deploy a code signing cert, right? So some of that is going to become less critical. Discovery could be hard, right? How do you discover them if they're just, someone's got them, on their hard disk? But it's still good to have visibility if you can have them or poke them into your system and when they're expiring. The last thing you want to do is have, emails aren't working because SMIME cert's expired, or you can't sign your documents because doc signing cert's expired, or you can't sign your code because code signing cert's expired. So some of these concepts absolutely make sense. Some of them a little less so. You want to add to that, Jay?
I would say, regardless of your certificate type, especially if it's a very static type, like a code signing certificate, the storage and protection of the private key material is incredibly important. So therefore, whether you store it in an HSM or, and that can come in many form factors, I think that's the biggest consideration for very, very static credential types and certificate types, such as a code signing certificate. Make sure you're storing those things very securely.
All right, guys, and with that, we have our last question.
Okay.
When you renew a certificate directly with a public CA, they will offer a grace period so that you can renew ahead of time without losing any of the certificate lifespan you paid for. Can you do this with automated renewal as well?
Right. So if I go and I buy a cert, and then renewal time comes around and they send me an email and they say renew, the idea is I can renew up to 30 days before the certificate actually expires, and I get my new cert right away, and they add the extra time on. So if my cert expires on the 1st, I renew on the 15th of the month before, I get an extra 15 days. And what that does is that allows me to not have to wait until the last possible instant to swap my cert out if I'm worried about losing certificate time that I paid for. Can your automated solution do that? I'm sure if you're using an aftermarket platform, it does. I know that Certificate Manager does from Sectigo. If you're doing that through, let's say, Acme, My guess would be no. I'm not sure of that, but my guess would be no. Jay, do you happen to know that?
Yeah, Acme will absolutely conform with however the policies are set from your CA. So the Acme protocol in itself, it's not determining the expiry time, it's the policies of the underlying CA. So those kinds of deployment protocols will typically conform with the policy set by the CA.
Okay, so that would depend on okay,
Yeah,
fair enough.
there's your answer. It depends.
All right. And so often it's our answer.
Well, perfect. As always, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you,
you.
Kristen.
And thank you all for joining us. I know we did receive a few very specific questions. We'll definitely connect with you offline to get answers to you. And we will be sharing today's webinar recording tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that email. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day.